Good afternoon. Today we look at the gospel. Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. It's one of the resurrection appearances. Two disciples of Jesus are walking along the road to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Emmaus does not exist today. We're not real sure where it was in Jesus' day. That doesn't really matter because it was there then, and these two disciples were walking along the road, and we know they're not one of the original apostles. Why? Well, toward the end of this lesson, we know that they go and tell the other 11, the 11 apostles, what they saw and experienced that day on the road to Emmaus. So what happened? Well, this is the story of Jesus' resurrection appearance to these two disciples, and they don't recognize him. That's not the first time this happens in the resurrection experiences. Instead, they're walking along. Someone, they think just a fellow traveler joins them along, and they're amazed when he doesn't seem to know what's happened in Jerusalem in those days. And so they tell him about how Jesus had been crucified and how some had seen the empty tomb, but they didn't know what to think. And then Jesus, who they still don't recognize, interprets the scriptures, the writings of the prophets, to them and shows how Jesus the Messiah was in fact the fulfillment of all the prophecy. And this story comes with just layers upon layers of theology. We see theology from Scripture here and from the Old Testament prophets. And so we see Christology, the study of Christ. We see, we read about God, and that's what the word theology means, is the study of God. And so, there's just layer upon layer of theology here and of understandings. But the most important thing is that it also speaks to revelation, because we come to know more about the resurrected Christ through this story. And it's when the disciples reach the end of their journey that day into a house, and they ask the resurrected Christ to come with them. And he comes into the house, and they sit down, and Jesus breaks the bread as he did in the upper room at the Last Supper, and their eyes are opened. And so, one of the most important things for us to understand about these stories is they tell us the story of God. And in the New Testament, particularly in the New Testament, and particularly in the gospel lessons, they tell us the story of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who is God the Son. And so all these stories are about God. And then how the disciples react and how the people react, and that is clue for us as to how we're to take this scripture in our own lives and to begin to let it feed us in spirit and in soul. And scripture is revelation. That's what makes it different from any other book. When I was getting ready for seminary, our bishop in West Tennessee sent me to Father George Gibson. I will never forget Father Gibson. He was in a wheelchair, retired priest. He had been a minister for probably 50, maybe even 60 years. Tremendous amount of wisdom. And he would start reading the scriptures with Genesis 1:1 and go all the way through to the end of Revelation. Then he would turn around and start reading again. And then he'd do it again and again and again. I asked him one time, I said, "George, don't you ever get bored?" And he says, "Well," he says, there are those parts about the begats, and some of the books can get to be a bit tedious in their writing. But the thing is," he said, "Scripture's a living document. It's not a novel. It's not a history book. It's not a science book. It is testimony of God's work with God's people, God's love for God's people, and particularly the story of Jesus and how Christ came, and through his death and resurrection, we have been given life eternal." And so he says, every time I read it, God speaks to me in a new way. Scripture is God's revelation of himself to us. And so you read over and over and over, and God speaks new each time. And so that's such a marvelous illustration here with Jesus interpreting the scriptures, which these disciples may have known these scriptures all of their lives, but now they're hearing something new. They're hearing something new from the very Son of God. And so their eyes are opened, though not in hearing the scripture necessarily, but in the breaking of bread. And God's revealed to us as well in the breaking of bread, now, and in the sharing of the common cup. But I know you miss Eucharist as much as I do. I'm yearning for the time when all of us can come back. And by the way, one of my favorite little Hebrew things that I learned in seminary was that the word for God's will is also the same word in Hebrew for God's yearning for us. And so I think that when we're yearning for the Eucharist, when we're yearning for the fellowship of Christ, and we're yearning to serve others as we serve God, I think that that's how we live in God's will. I've always said God's will, God's yearning for us is to love God and love our neighbors, and everything else just sort of falls into place. So what's really key about this is that we see this, not only the call of God to follow, and not only the call of God to learn more of God in Scriptures, but also the reminder of Holy Eucharist as the opportunity for us to be fed spiritually. It's spiritual food for our spiritual journeys, and it's the whole liturgy of the Eucharist, I think, that's so important. You can't just take the part about the bread and the wine and separate it off like it has some special powers or something. It's when we gather together and we hear God's word proclaimed and we offer our prayers, and then everyone at St. Matthias knows that we're fed by the peace. And then we come together at the altar rail and we receive bread and wine together, and then we go out into the world to feed others by what we have found at St. Matthias. And this story just lends itself to all of us so much. I love the idea about our hearts were burning. For those of you who were Methodist, that was a major theme among John Wesley. And then, there's the whole thing about how Jesus was the fulfillment of the prophecies. There's the whole thing in here about, recognizing that God is always new. So, a lot of stuff for a sermon here. Don't plan to preach on everything I find here, but God is speaking, and I think I kind of know where I'm going to go. So, be sure and watch morning prayer this Sunday. It'll be online by no later than 8 a.m., and hopefully real soon we'll be back together again, and that once more we will receive spiritual food for our spiritual journeys through the fellowship at St. Matthias. Have a great week.